If you look at the official economic data released by the United States government, the picture is one of stability. Unemployment is low, GDP is growing, and consumer spending remains robust. But if you look at the reality on the ground, at the kitchen tables where families are deciding between rent and groceries, or at the bank accounts of the generation entering the workforce, you see a completely different story. We are witnessing the quiet, mathematical liquidation of the American middle class. This is not a temporary recession or a cyclical downturn. It is a structural dismantling of the economic engine that defined the 20th century. The promise that hard work leads to stability, homeownership, and a dignified retirement has not just been broken. It has been engineered out of existence by a monetary system that requires the dilution of your labor to sustain its own solvency. The truly terrifying aspect of this collapse is its invisibility. It doesn't happen with a sudden crash or a declared bankruptcy, but through the slow, relentless erosion of purchasing power. Since 1971, the cost of the American dream, housing, education, healthcare, and energy, has inflated by thousands of percent, while wages, when adjusted for real inflation, have remained stagnant. The middle class is running on a treadmill that is speeding up every single day, fueled by a credit system that turns citizens into indentured servants of debt. We are no longer living in a capitalist society of owners. We are transitioning into a neo-feudal society of renters, where the vast majority of the population owns nothing and leases their quality of life from a shrinking elite. To understand how we got here, we have to look beyond the headlines and into the deep machinery of the global financial system. We have to trace the path of the dollar from a golden anchor to a fiat weapon and understand how the very policies touted as saving the economy during every crisis since 2008 were actually the nails in the coffin of the middle class. The data is undeniable. The pattern is historical. The conclusion is mathematical. The system cannot be fixed because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: extract wealth from the productive many to the asset-holding few. OD2, context and stakes. The stakes of this silent crisis extend far beyond individual bank accounts. The middle class has historically been the stabilizing force of democracy. In every major empire, from Rome to the Dutch Republic, the erosion of the middle stratum signaled the beginning of the end. When a society bifurcates into the ultra-rich and the desperate poor, the social contract dissolves. Polarization increases, trust in institutions evaporates, and the political landscape becomes ripe for extremism. We are seeing these symptoms manifest across America today: the rise of populism, the breakdown of social cohesion, and the pervasive sense that the game is rigged. This is not just an economic issue, it is a civilization-level threat. The urgency of this moment lies in the concept of velocity. For decades, the decline was gradual, masked by cheap credit and cheap consumer goods imported from abroad. But we have entered a new phase. The debt supercycle has peaked. The United States government is now borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already owes. This fiscal dominance forces the Federal Reserve to choose between two catastrophic options: allow the banking system to collapse, or print trillions of dollars to monetize the debt. They have chosen the latter. This choice guarantees that inflation will not be transitory, but a permanent feature of American life, accelerating the transfer of wealth away from wage earners who cannot hedge against the debasement of their currency. Understanding this mechanism is the only defense the individual has left. The old rules, save 10% of your income, buy a house, invest in a 401k, were written for a different monetary environment. Following them today is a prescription for poverty. The mathematical end refers to the point where the cost of living exceeds the earning potential of labor for the median citizen. By many metrics, we have already crossed that threshold. The median home price in America is now nearly 6 times the median income, a ratio higher than during the Great Depression. The dream isn't dying. The math says it's already dead. O3, historical rewind sequence. To find the origin of this calculation, we must travel back to the post-war era, specifically to the 1950s and 60s. This was the golden age of the American middle class. A single income could support a family, buy a home, and save for a pension. This prosperity wasn't accidental. It was structural. The US dollar was pegged to gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement, which imposed a strict discipline on government spending and currency creation. Because the money supply was anchored to a physical reality, inflation was low and savings retained their value. A dollar earned in 1950 could purchase roughly the same amount of goods in 1960. This stability allowed for long-term planning and capital accumulation, the bedrock of a middle class. However, the seeds of destruction were sown in the guns and butter policies of the 1960s. President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to fight the Vietnam War and build the Great Society welfare state simultaneously. The tax revenue wasn't there, so the government began to print money, effectively issuing more claims on gold than there was gold in the vaults. Foreign nations, particularly France, noticed this dilution and began redeeming their paper dollars for physical bullion. The U.S. gold reserves began to hemorrhage. The discipline of the anchor was becoming a political liability. This culminated in the pivotal moment of August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon, facing a run on the gold reserves, appeared on television and unilaterally severed the direct convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold. He promised it was temporary. It was not. In that instant, the U.S. dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but government decree. The discipline was removed. The government could now print money at will to fund its deficits. This fundamentally changed the economic physics of the world. Before 1971, productivity and wages grew in tandem. After 1971, productivity continued to rise, but wages flattened. The surplus value that used to go to the worker was now siphoned off by inflation and redirected to the financial sector. The great divergence had begun before. Narrative, deep dive. The divergence is best understood through the story of the financialization of the American economy. In the 1980s, facing high inflation from the previous decade, the financial sector began to take dominance over the industrial sector. The culture of shareholder value emerged, championed by economists like Milton Friedman. The goal of a corporation shifted from providing stability in goods to maximizing short-term stock prices. This led to the outsourcing of the American industrial base. Manufacturing jobs, the high-paying, unionized roles that built the middle class, were shipped to developing nations where labor was cheap. This hollowed out the Rust Belt and forced millions of workers into the service economy, where wages were lower and benefits scarce. But the political elite had a solution to mask this decline: credit. If they couldn't give the middle class higher wages, they would give them access to debt. The 1990s and 2000s saw the explosion of consumer credit cards, student loans, and eventually the subprime mortgage bubble. Families maintained their standard of living not by earning more, but by borrowing against their future. The home became an ATM machine. The wealth effect of rising asset prices created an illusion of prosperity that hid the rotting foundation of wage stagnation. This narrative reached its breaking point in 2008. The great financial crisis was the moment the debt bill came due. But instead of allowing the system to reset, which would have wiped out the bad debt and the reckless banks, the government intervened with quantitative easing. They printed trillions of dollars to buy toxic assets from the banks. This saved the financial institutions, but punished the savers. Interest rates were pushed to zero, destroying the ability of the middle class to earn a safe yield on their savings. The message from the Federal Reserve was clear: if you save money, you will lose. If you speculate in assets, you will win. This forced the middle class into the stock market casino, exposing them to risks they didn't understand, while the newly printed money flowed directly into the hands of the wealthy, exacerbating inequality to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. 5. Mechanism breakdown. The mechanism destroying the middle class is often referred to as the Cantillon effect. Named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, it describes the uneven distribution of new money. When a central bank prints money, it does not drop it from a helicopter evenly to everyone. It injects it into the top of the system, to the big banks, the government, and large corporations. These entities get to use the new money first, while prices are still low. They buy up hard assets, real estate, stocks, and commodities. By the time the money circulates down to the wage earner, in the form of a meager salary bump, prices for those assets have already risen. The elite buy the lifeboat, the middle class pays for the water. Coupled with this is the mechanism of asset price inflation. We are told that inflation is low because the Consumer Price Index, CPI, says so. But the CPI is a flawed metric that uses substitution and hedonic adjustments to understate the real cost of living. It measures the price of a television, but it fails to capture the exploding cost of the things that actually secure a middle-class life: housing, education, and healthcare. These are the non-discretionary items. You can choose not to buy a TV. You cannot choose not to have a roof over your head. When the money supply expands, it flows into these scarce assets, bidding up their price. This creates a wealth gap that is actually an inflation gap. The assets owned by the rich inflate, the wages earned by the poor stagnate. The final gear in this machine is financial repression. This is the deliberate policy of keeping interest rates below the rate of inflation. For nearly 15 years, the real interest rate in America has been negative. If inflation is 5% and your savings account pays 1%, you're losing 4% of your purchasing power every year. This is a silent tax on prudence. It punishes the saver and rewards the debtor. Who is the biggest debtor in the world? The U.S. government. By keeping rates suppressed, the government effectively transfers wealth from the savers, the middle class, to the borrowers, the state, and the corporate sector, to pay down its massive liabilities. It is a slow-motion default that liquidates the middle class to keep the sovereign afloat. 6. Parallel to today. We can see a stark historical parallel in the Weimar Republic of 1920s Germany. Before the wheelbarrows of cash became a meme, the German middle class was wiped out by a similar mechanism. The government, burdened by unpayable war debts, chose to print money. Initially, it created a boom. The stock market soared and industry hummed. But the middle class, who held their wealth in bonds and savings, saw their life's work evaporate. The speculators and the industrialists who borrowed heavily to buy hard assets became the new elite, while the professors, civil servants, and professionals were reduced to poverty. The social fabric tore apart, creating the vacuum that allowed for the rise of extremism. We see echoes of the decline of the Roman Empire as well. In the 3rd century, Rome faced a fiscal crisis. To pay its legions and its bureaucracy, emperors began debasing the silver denarius, mixing it with cheap copper. The currency lost 99% of its value over a century. The result was that the middle class, the shopkeepers and small farmers, were crushed by inflation and taxation. They were forced to sell their land to the ultra-wealthy elite and become coloni or serfs, working the land they once owned. Today we see this in the subscription economy and the rise of institutional landlords like BlackRock. The American middle class is being turned into modern-day colony, renting the American dream from a new class of corporate patricians. The parallel is not just economic, it is psychological. In every dying monetary regime, there is a phase of speculative fever. When labor no longer pays, people turn to gambling. We saw this in the tulip mania of the Dutch Golden Age, and we see it today in the obsession with meme stocks, cryptocurrency speculation, and zero DTE options trading. It is the behavior of a desperate population realizing that the slow, steady path to wealth is closed, and only a moonshot can save them. It is a sign of a society that has lost its economic tether. 7. Hidden forces and power structures. The erosion of the middle class is further accelerated by the regulatory capture of the U.S. government. The very agencies designed to protect the public, the SEC, the FDA, the EPA, are often staffed by former executives of the industries they regulate. This creates a revolving door where policy is written to favor incumbents and stifle competition. Small businesses, traditionally the biggest driver of middle-class wealth creation, are crushed under the weight of compliance costs that only large conglomerates can afford. This moat protects the profits of the too-big-to-fail class while systematically destroying the too-small-to-succeed entrepreneur. Behind the scenes, the passive investing revolution has consolidated corporate power into the hands of a big three: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These asset managers control tens of trillions of dollars and own significant stakes in nearly every major company in the S&P 500. This concentration of ownership means that the competitive drive to lower prices for consumers is replaced by a drive to maximize extraction. We see this in the housing market, where institutional capital is buying up entire neighborhoods of single-family starter homes to turn them into rentals. The entry-level home, once the cornerstone of middle-class equity, is being removed from the market by entities with access to near zero-cost capital provided by the Federal Reserve. There is also the incentive structure of the fiat gerontocracy. The political class in Washington is overwhelmingly older and wealthier than the median American. Their wealth is tied up in asset prices, stocks, and real estate. Therefore, every policy decision is filtered through the lens of asset protection. If housing prices were to fall to affordable levels, it would be a catastrophe for the boomers and the banks. So the government enacts policies to prop up prices, effectively pulling the ladder up behind them. The young and the middle class are sacrificed to protect the retirement portfolios of the old and the balance sheets of the elite. It is intergenerational theft codified into law. 8. Acceleration phase. We are now in the acceleration phase of this collapse, driven by the weaponization of the US dollar. Since the sanctions on Russia in 2022, the world has realized that the dollar is not a neutral reserve asset, but a political tool. This has triggered de-dollarization, where nations like China, Russia, and the BRICS bloc are actively trading in their own currencies and hoarding gold. As global demand for dollars weakens, those dollars will eventually flood back into the U.S. domestic economy, triggering a second, more vicious wave of inflation. The exorbitant privilege that allowed Americans to consume more than they produced is ending. Automation and artificial intelligence are the next accelerants. Unlike the outsourcing of the 90s, which took blue-collar jobs, the AI revolution targets the white-collar knowledge workers, the accountants, coders, copywriters, and middle managers. These are the pillars of the modern middle class. We are facing a future of technological unemployment, where a small number of tech monopolies capture almost all the productivity gains, while the displaced workforce fights for scraps in the gig economy. The barbell shape of the economy will become more pronounced. A thin layer of trillionaires at the top, a mass of precarious service workers at the bottom, and a vacuum where the middle used to be. The fiscal situation of the U.S. government ensures this trend cannot reverse. With deficits running at $2 trillion a year during peacetime and prosperity, there is no mathematical path to a balanced budget. The only way out is financial repression on steroids. We will likely see the implementation of yield curve control, where the Fed caps interest rates regardless of inflation, and potentially central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, that allow for negative interest rates and direct stimulus that bypasses the banking system. These tools will give the state absolute control over the economy, finalizing the transition from free market capitalism to a centrally planned command economy where the middle class is entirely dependent on state largesse for survival. Or 9. Climax and revelation. The climax of this economic tragedy brings us to the Great Liquidation. This is the big truth that is rarely spoken aloud in policy circles. The liquidation of the middle class is not an unfortunate side effect of current policy. It is the mathematical requirement for the system to survive. The United States government has accumulated over $175 trillion in unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, and government pensions, promises made to the baby boomer generation that simply cannot be paid with tax revenue. There are only 2 ways to resolve a debt of this magnitude: explicit default, where the government tells retirees they won't get their checks, or implicit default, where they print the money to pay the checks, but the money buys half as much. The revelation is that the government has already chosen the second path. They are engaged in a process of financial repression, designed to burn off the real value of their debt by keeping inflation higher than interest rates. For the government, this is a survival strategy. For the middle class, who hold their wealth in cash, savings accounts, and fixed income pensions, it is a confiscation of wealth. You are the collateral damage in a sovereign debt restructuring. The safety you thought you had in the dollar was an illusion. You were storing your life energy in a battery that was leaking by design. The system is transferring the solvency of the American household to the balance sheet of the American state. This leads to the uncomfortable realization that the middle class itself may have been a historical anomaly, a brief, glorious parenthesis in history created by the unique conditions of the post-Opium era: cheap energy, high industrialization, gold-backed money. As those conditions revert to the mean, we are seeing a return to the historical norm: a small ownership class and a large laboring class. The ladder of upward mobility has been pulled up not by malice, but by the cold, unyielding gravity of debt mechanics. The American dream was a product of a specific mathematical equation that no longer exists. 10. Ending. As we conclude this examination, we must resist the urge to succumb to nihilism and instead embrace the clarity of the situation. The era of passive prosperity is over. The mathematical end of the middle class signifies the close of the 20th century economic chapter. We are entering a new paradigm where the rules of survival have fundamentally changed. In this new era, financial literacy is not about getting a good credit score. It is about understanding the nature of money itself. It is about recognizing that in a world of infinite paper currency, the only true wealth is finite, tangible, and productive. The collapse of the middle class is a warning siren. It signals that the trust placed in third-party institutions, banks to hold your money, corporations to provide your job, and governments to secure your retirement, has been misplaced. The future belongs to those who reclaim their sovereignty. It belongs to those who build local communities, acquire hard skills, and own assets that cannot be debased by a central banker's keystroke. The storm is not coming. The storm is here. The roof of the middle class has been blown off, and we are now standing in the rain. History teaches us that empires rise and fall, currencies are born and die, but the human spirit is resilient. The American middle class may be mathematically finished as a statistical aggregate, but the American individual still has the agency to adapt. The system has revealed its hand. The cards are on the table. The question is no longer, when will things go back to normal? But rather, what will you build in the new reality? The calculation has run its course. The rest of the equation is up to you.